Welcome back. This is our third and final tutorial for the combination of Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. It covers all of Chapter 7 and a good portion of Chapter 8. So this is going to be the review of what we did in our first two videos. We talk about data definition commands, data manipulation commands, constraints, database model, authentication, the database schema, and table structure. So this is from the book. So if you missed this, you can look in the book. These are the definitions of the SQL that you're putting in here. We talked about create table. We talked about not none unique and all of these things in here. We talked about drop table a little bit, drop index. We haven't created views. Views are just results that you can look at, sort of like a query in here, the results of a query. And the data manipulations, insert, select, where, group by, having. We talked, there's logical operators, and, or not, special characters. And so here again, data manipulation commands, insert, and here is the syntax. Commit is something we haven't talked about. If you're doing database programming, you write to what is called a buffer or a cache, and it doesn't actually write to the database until you put commit. So that will make sure that it gets written to the hard disk permanently. And you want to do that because if there's an issue where you're updating 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tables, maybe even more at the same time, and all of a sudden 4 of them work, and then something happens and the system halts, then you're going to have corrupt data. So the commit allows you, after you get done writing to everything, you put the commit in there, it makes it update permanently. If something happens, the commit will never happen itself, the data will never get written, and as a result, your data stays integrity in here. So again, we have the select, we have the update, we talked about that, and you can use wildcard characters as well. The where, the rollback is once you do something, you commit something, and then something you realize went wrong, you can actually roll back. It's kind of like if you're installing a new device driver on your computer, and there should be something that will say roll back to last version. This is what it does. It stores it in the database. That's all done for you automatically. If you do the rollback, it will go back to exactly what it was before. And delete, just be very careful about deleting in here. I don't want to really talk about it because it's a dangerous thing to use unless you're really, really, really sure that you want to do it. Again, constraints are nothing more than rules. Not null is probably, and unique is probably the biggest ones you're going to use. And of course, you're going to have default and check. Check really is a constraint, a numeric most of the time, or it could be a string to make sure that the city is in, maybe you have a region, and the region is Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, and then somebody puts in the great state of New York, it should kick it out because it's not in there. Again, this is from the book. You can see the database model in here. Now, we want to talk about this over here. We have customer, and it generates invoice. So that's the verb, and these are nouns in here. Notice this is one and only one, and this means it can be 0 or many. The 0 here means just because you have a customer doesn't mean it has to have a physical invoice in here. Maybe he didn't buy anything. Maybe he created an account and never ordered anything. Now you have here one and only one, because you can only have one invoice header. I prefer to use invoice header and invoice detail or invoice line. The book is using this over here as line, and that's perfectly fine because they're line items. So you can have one and only one, but you can't have an invoice header without any physical line items. So this would be a case for commit. So a customer creates an invoice, and right in the middle of the invoice, the customer says, nah, forget about it. I don't want it. Well, if you wrote the invoice header, you would have an invoice header with no line items. So then we have each line item. Now notice you have a primary key and a foreign key and a primary key in here. And then you have a second foreign key. You can have multiple primary keys in here. So you have the invoice number and the line number are the primary keys. Invoice number is a foreign key, and these are foreign keys. Is the P code, line item, line units, and price are not. So do not be confused that this foreign key 1 is actually listed over here. That just means that invoice number is both a foreign key and a primary key, or part of a primary key. It's a composite, because this could not be a primary key, because the invoice number, if you have 5 line items, they're all going to be for the same invoice header number, the invoice number. That would not qualify. So you would have invoice number 101, line 1, invoice number 101, line 2, 101, line 3, and so on. So that you can see this is one to many. This is one and only one. There can only be one invoice number associated with this. Then we have a product. Again, we have a vendor that we've already created products, and we've already established the fact that just because they have a product doesn't mean anybody's ordering it. That's why you have the 0 here. Then you have a vendor. This means 0 to 1 to 0 to many in here. So you have a vendor. That doesn't mean he has any products. That's why you put the zeros in here. Creating a database, again, we talked about that. Authentication. If you are a good database manager, and I know you are, then what will happen is before you do anything, you must authenticate into the system. And that is called, what you're doing is authenticating means basically you're saying who you are. And that's all it is. It doesn't give you any privileges. It basically says that your authentication in there. So if you've taken the networking classes and the server classes, you'll learn about authentication and authorization. The database schema is really just a bunch of objects. If you go into Access, it gives you the entire schema, which is the tables, the forms, the queries, and the reports. Again, here is our data types. So we have number, and you can have 7, 2 in here. That means you can have 7 decimal places. So I'm sorry, 7 places with 2 decimal places, and you can have up to 7 digits long, including the sign. Notice that the minus sign actually takes up a place. So if you've taken the programming classes, you'll know about unsigned and signed integers. So obviously, a unsigned integer can go either one way or the other. The sign could be positive or negative. So then we have the different types. We're going to worry about char, varchar, and date. Creating table structures. Here's the general rules. You're going to use 1 item per attribute. Spaces. You can use spaces to line up the characteristics. And table, if you're using a good database manager, is going to do that for you. Make sure that you specify not null in there. You do not want a customer and have no name for it. Unique, make sure that you do that automatically for specific entries. If you want to have a primary key, it has to be unique. And then you're using parentheses in here. Index in here, creating an index, very simple. Unique, we talked about, and drop index. So basically, every table needs to have a primary key. If you're creating the table within Access, it will do it for you automatically. Then you're doing the select to get a subquery in here. We have not talked about subquery, so it's really not part of it, but I've given you a really decent example. So basically, you're doing a query, and then you're doing a second query in here. So you're taking a query, and then from that query, the results of that query, you're doing a second query. So we have an example of a marks, getting some specific marks in here. So you'll see that in a bit. So again, it's nested in a larger query. So you're going to have a select, from, and where. And then again, the same standard things that you can do in here. So maybe you want to insert something for all customers that meet a specific query. So you do that. So here you can use all the comparison operators in any and all, and basically it's called a inner query or inner select. However, use whatever terminology you want. So what happens is the first query executes first, and then before its parent query, so the results of the inner query can be passed to the outer query. How exciting is that? Again, select, insert, delete. You can use all of these things in here. Here is the syntax. Select, and then whatever your list is from where it is, and then you have your expression. Then your second query is in parentheses. Then you're doing select, select list from. Sort of like nested if or nested whiles in here. So the subquery, the inner query is going to do once before the main query, outer query executes in here. So it's kind of backwards. Just remember the inner query executes before the outer query. And so I've given you a problem, and this is taken from a website that I found that did a great job. And I have bits and pieces of the website, and then I have a link to the website so you can read more detail about that. So you want to write a query to identify all students who get better marks than one of the students whose student ID is V002, but the marks of V002 are unknown. Oh well. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to write two queries. The first query returns the marks of V02, which is the total marks field. And the second query identifies the ones that got better marks. So if that was me, there would be a lot of students ahead of me. So again, here is the student table and the marks table. So if we look over here, we can see V002 got 80. But at least he's not the low man on the totem pole. So the first query, select from, which is all fields, from marks, where student ID equals V002. So here's the first query result, and he got an 80. Then the second one is select students, student ID, student's name, so on and so forth. The student ID equals the marks ID, and the marks ID is greater than 80. So basically, it sounds harder than it really is, but just saying, I want to know all the results of these things. We're using kind of where the inner join over here, and we're going to do where the marks ID is greater than 80. So the second query is right over here, and here is the results of it. So I'm giving you also a way to do an alias. So you can use alias A and B so that you don't have to constantly write students. If you have a whole bunch of fields, there's a more margin of error by spelling students wrong. So you can use A and B to replace it. So you've got select A.student ID, A.name, B.total, and what we put over here, A from student, A marks B. So basically you're saying that we're using A for student and B for marks, where A.student equals B and total marks in here. And then we have the second total over here is the second select, total marks from marks where student ID equals in there. So here is the link to the subquery example, which explains a little bit more. Here is the actual outcome of it, explained a little better. This is directly from that website over here. Hopefully that helps you. I'm not going to go over it. You can look at it in as well. So selecting rows using conditional restrictions. We talked about that. This is a review in here. So we're using the where. Comparison operators, again, basically the same in here. And we're using column alias, again, an alternate name given to a column or table to improve the readability. I'm not a big fan of using A and B, so just be careful when you do that. Rule of precedence, exactly like what you learned in math class in there. Very first thing is parentheses. The parentheses win. And they also give greater clarity. If you ever take my programming class, IT 301, the C++ program, I make it a requirement that you use parentheses in every compound expression. Then power comes second, multiplication and division comes third, and then addition and subtractions become fourth. on a off note, while I was on vacation over the summer, I looked at something, I believe on Facebook, and it was a simple math problem that any 8th grader should be able to do that knows about precedence. And you wouldn't believe how I was saying maybe 75% of the people got it wrong. And they were challenging math teachers. I actually have a math degree, and I knew how to do this. And people were calling me an idiot, uninformed. And I'm sitting there going, you don't know that parentheses wins. And I someday maybe I'll find it and post it and see how you do on that. So again, the arithmetic operators. So if you're confused about the order preference, don't worry. Probably about 70% of America is as well. Again, review of logical operators. The special operators between is null. And no base just checks to see if it's null, period. In C++, there's a function that checks to see if something is null. Like allows you to have things without expelling everything out. In checks to see if it's in a specific group. And then exist checks if a subquery returns in. Alter table, again, we talked about. Add, modify, and drop. Changing a column's data type and characteristics, we talked about as well. And adding and dropping columns in here. So dropping, I don't know whether you use drop. It's the same thing as delete. I did not write the SQL, so unfortunately, I don't have any say. And then again, copying parts of tables is permittable as well. We're not going to go into it, but you can do that. Adding primary and foreign keys, you can do that as well. Deleting a table from the database, just drop table. That's all. Additional select commands, again, count, find minimum, maximum value, calculate averages, and then also you want to make sure that there's no duplicates in there, the unique in here. We talked about order by, cascading order sequences, just multi-level ordering sequences, a little bit more explained in chapter 8. Unique values is distinct, and some more aggregate functions, all duplication here. Grouping, again, here is the syntax to group. Notice that it's having and not where. Here's your having command, similar to where. Joining a database, we talked about that. Joining table is alias and recursive joins is okay. And database updates is update and Oracle rollback command undoes changes made by the last 2 update statements. All right, if you have any questions, then this is your lucky day. Please email me with any question that you may have. If there's a specific video, you may email with me. I'm going to create separate videos on SQL and how to use them in the database to add tables, to update tables, to insert tables as well. So be looking forward to making those and be looking in Canvas to see them. Well, that's it. That's all I got for this video, folks. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.